be hearing from Carl Bowman, who will be giving a talk called Names from the Earth, Where Did They Come From? And to get us started tonight, I want you to introduce you to the idea that the Grand Canyon Historical Society has a mission that celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And I'm very happy to say that this year, 2024, we are celebrating our 40th year of existence. And those of you that are members can go to the summer issue of our quarterly magazine, The Old Pioneer, and read an article by Dick Brown and Al Richmond, who were charter members of this organization, and wrote a short history of the start of the Historical Society. We really encourage that if you are not a member, our dues are only $35 a year, and they include 4 issues of the Old Pioneer, which also includes the bulletin. It's very easy to become a member. Just go to grandcanyonhistory.org and click on the membership tab. These are some examples of the Old Pioneer magazine, which comes out 4 times a year and includes our news bulletin as well at the back of the Old Pioneer. We've been publishing this for a number of decades now, and it's a very good resource for all things history at the Grand Canyon. The virtual outings can be found. They're going to be recorded, and you can find them on our website. Again, that's grandcanyonhistory.org. And we have the recordings online for all of our virtual outings, which we've been doing since the pandemic. And you may remember the pandemic from a few years ago, and it was decided that this was a good way to provide a benefit for our members and the public. We also facilitate an oral history program, and a number of oral histories have been taken. In this image right here, we're just highlighting an oral history that my co-host tonight, Tom Sulpizio, was interviewing my father, who you can see on the bottom left there. My father worked for the Civil Aeronautics Agency back in 1956 when the tragic air collision between the United Airlines and TWA collided over Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon Historical Society is currently working with the National Park Service to have more of an interpretive presence at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. You can see a view here from the Desert View Watchtower at some place close to Desert View. We hope to have interpretive signs that will interpret this very tragic crash that happened in 1956. If any of you have an idea for a presentation that you would like to see, you can contact us specifically at outings@grandcanyonhistory.org, and we'd love to hear from you, whether you want to make comments about tonight or other presentations that we've made, or things that you'd like to see in the future. Please let us know. The next virtual outing, we try to have these as predictable as we can. We shoot for the second Tuesday of every month, and the next one will be December the 10th. Mike Nelson, who is an author and a Historical Society member, will present part 2 of his presentation, We Are Going In. Mike has written the definitive book about what might have happened in that crash, and the book is now in its 2nd edition and is one of the great sellers at Grand Canyon National Park. So on December the 10th, we invite all of you to join us for that. So tonight, without further ado, we want to welcome Carl Bowman, who has developed a presentation called Names from the Earth, Where Did They Come From? And Carl has researched the history of naming of rock layers in the Grand Canyon and found that at least 231 different names have been used by geologists to describe these different rock layers. And those of you that have studied a little bit of Grand Canyon's history will know that the major rock naming unit is the formation, things like Coconino Sandstone, Toro Weep Formation, Kaibab Formation. But formations can also be made into members. Sometimes they're grouped and sometimes they're made supergroups. And it'd be very interesting tonight to hear what the history of this naming has come from. Carl has worked for the National Park Service for 30 years in a variety of jobs. He was 17 years as the park's air quality specialist. And I remember the day that I met Carl out at Yavapai Point when he was checking on the clean air station at Yavapai Point that was pointing down to Phantom Ranch. His degree is in biology, but he is very well versed in the Colorado Plateau's geology, and he loves to share his findings with the public. And Carl has very graciously provided a link to a chronostratigraphic chart. This is a chart that shows the age relationships of Grand Canyon's many rock layers. You'll see that on the first slide. And if you just go to the invitation that you received to attend this talk and the follow-up that will come after the recording is posted, you will see this link to that chart. Makes for beautiful wall art. And so at this time, I'm going to stop my share and invite Carl Bowman to present his talk tonight. Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you, Wayne, and pleasure to be here tonight. And we'll see if see how good I am at this screen sharing business here. That's the screen I want. There we go. Is that working? Yes, there we go. So names from the earth, naming rock units in the Grand Canyon. Names from the earth, for the earth. Tonight we'll be not looking at all 231 layers that Wayne mentioned. What I've decided to do is pare things down a little bit, and I'm going to talk mostly about the ones that folks might be familiar with, the rock layers that form the colorful layers in the canyon walls that you may know a mnemonic or two for. So let's see here. Okay, it came up, but now it's not. There we go. So naming things, it's something that us humans like to do, and we've been doing it for a long, long time. Um, this is an engraving from the 1700s showing Adam naming the animals. Well, there are a lot of different reasons why we might name something. We name something to identify it, like our own personal names. Um, we also can use names to describe something. Some of our rock layers, like the red wall, have a very distinctive name. We can use them to distinguish things. Saying the red rock layers in the Grand Canyon doesn't narrow things down very well. There's at least 8 different formations that are red. Some of the names may commemorate someone or something or some event. Sometimes names are used to claim things. We call it the Grand Canyon today, but it had a lot of different names before we started calling it the Grand Canyon. And especially for me and dealing with rock layers, names are a way to organize information. And naming things doesn't always guarantee that people are going to get it right. And that's why I put this lovely picture on this slide. This is the Grand Canyon Tourist Guide. And you can see that it has just a beautiful picture of Dead Horse Point State Park up in Utah on the cover of it. So sometimes the names work and sometimes they don't. But it does help if we want to look at these things to define the Grand Canyon. And Grand Canyon can be 2 things. I use both definitions. One of them is it's a big hole in the ground. And George Billingsley worked at USGS, produced this map that defines the rim of the Grand Canyon. And if you're standing in Grand Canyon Village, it's pretty obvious where the rim is. But especially when you get out into the western part of the Grand Canyon on the Wallapai Reservation, the rim gets kind of weird out there. The Kaibab limestone disappears, and you've got to figure out something else. So George Billingsley's map is the one that I used when I was trying to define which rock layers were or were not within the Grand Canyon. The other Grand Canyon that I considered was the national park. And there are parts of the national park that aren't in the hole in the ground. and there are parts of the hole in the ground that aren't in Grand Canyon National Park. So I considered both boundaries when I was deciding which rock layers were in Grand Canyon. Now, how do we name rocks? Well, it's scientific, of course. We're talking geology, but it's really part geology and part history. The geology of the rocks that we're looking at, but also the history of the investigations that have preceded them. And I'm trying not to fall into the trap that's illustrated by my little XKCD cartoons about experts wildly overestimate the average person's familiarity with their field. I'm not a geologist or a historian, so hopefully I'm not going to shoot too high here. So when we're naming rocks, like Wayne mentioned, the basic unit is the formation. The formation is a rock layer um, in this instance. And like Wayne pointed out, sometimes formations can be lumped together in groups, and the groups can be lumped together in supergroups. Sometimes the formation can be divided up into members. Sometimes that's not necessary. Or sometimes only part of a formation will be given a member status, and the rest of the formation just carries the formation's name. Then formations or members can also be subdivided further down into beds and facies and horizons and that kind of stuff. But tonight, what I'm going to be dealing with almost entirely are formations. So, what is a formation? Well, you know, you say a rock formation, and a lot of people think about something like the stalagmite that I have there, picture on the right. That's not the kind of formation I'm talking about. I'm talking about a geologist formation, which is a layer of rock. And to be a formation, it needs to be distinct. You have to be able to tell it from the layers above and below. It helps if there was a gap between the formation of the two of the formations, maybe a period of erosion or something like that, so that you have a clear line to distinguish the layers from each other. And it needs to be mappable. And when a formation is named, it's given a two-part name. The first part is a geographic name where the rock is exposed. And in some of our Grand Canyon rock layers, that first part might actually be two words, but it's the first part. We'll talk about why that happens. The second part is the kind of rock that the formation is made out of. If the formation is made out of just a single kind of rock, like the Coconino sandstone or the Redwall limestone, then we call it that. But if it's a mixture of different kinds of rock, some mudstones and some limestones mixed together or something like that, then we just stick with calling it a formation, like the Hermit Formation being a mixture of mudstones and sandstones. If you want a rock formation name to be official, there's some rules that you need to follow called the North American Stratigraphic Code. This is page 1 of 53. I'm not going to go through all 53. Just take my word for it. There's a lot of rules. And then the USGS has a website that has the official names that they have accepted, and it also has links to significant publications about those rock layers and that kind of stuff as well. So it's a very handy way of getting that information. When it comes to the geographic name that's part of the rock layer names, USGS also has a website for the Board of Geographic Names that gives official names in the United States, but I found that it's not always that helpful. Lots of times when you look up a name of a feature, it will tell you that the feature was named that because the name appears on a USGS topographic map. And that might be true, but it's not always helpful. So I periodically would consult other sources to try and figure out where different names came from. And some of the best sources were books about Grand Canyon place names, especially Nancy Bryan's River to Rim. I found it to be very complete and very accurate. But I also had to dig around periodically, especially for some of the indigenous names that we have in the Grand Canyon. A lot of our place names come from languages other than English, and ferreting out those meanings sometimes was a little bit tricky. But I have a big bookshelf full of places to look. So We looked at the chronographic start chronotime stratigraphy layering, and this is just a rundown through all of the well, not all, but most of the different layers that I found. This started out as a pandemic project, but the deeper I dug, the more I got buried. It took a couple of years after the pandemic to get to this point. That's a lot of names. 200 and well, 221 that I found in the literature. Um, some of those are real, honest to goodness official names that are listed on that USGS website, GeoLex. Um, discrete units, though, leaving out the groups and the supergroups, but just how many different layers are piled up on top of each other. Um, we have that. We have synonyms where different geologists have applied a different name to the same rock layer. The lava flows out in the western part of the Grand Canyon, a lot of names out there, but very, very few of them are official. Most of them are names that geologists just applied to a rock sample that they were picking up, and they wanted to know, they wanted to assign a name to it so they know where it came from. And then in the granite gorges, the Zoroaster granite, each of the big globs of granite sticking up down there in the granite gorges actually has a name. And a couple of those are official, but most of them are not. And then there's our old mnemonic, know the canyon's history, study rocks made by time. And that covers 9 of our units. There are also a lot of indigenous names that are applied in the Grand Canyon, and one Wallapai name, Meriwettica, and a few Paiute place names are actually the English interpretation of those language place names. Most of the names, though, are just indigenous words or family names or whatever that were applied by your Americans to features in the Grand Canyon. And all of the names that we use have been garbled up to a certain extent. And that's something I learned when I was trying to learn Navajo. It's really easy to garble up a language. So with all those different rock layers, can this be made simpler? A lot of different authors have tried to do that. Um, Eddie McKee, when he wrote his Ancient Landscapes of the Grand Canyon, divided things up into chapters. He had chapters 1 through 5. Back in the 90s, Allison Mathis and I tried to come up with a system for the rocks within the Grand Canyon. And starting from the bottom, the very oldest rocks, chapter 1 or the Vishnu basement rocks, those are the rocks of the granite gorges, the upper, middle, and lower granite gorge, the foundation of this part of North America. Chapter 2 are the Grand Canyon supergroup rocks, and those are those tilted rocks that you only see in the eastern part of the Grand Canyon, especially below Desert View. And then chapter 3, the ones that I'll be talking about tonight, those are the prominent layered rocks that form the upper walls of the Grand Canyon. Chapter 4, those are the rocks that were deposited during the age of dinosaurs. Within the Grand Canyon, there's only 2 formations that come from that chapter 4 period. But chapter 4 would also include the rocks of Zion, Glen Canyon, Arches, all those places. And then chapter 5 are the most recent rocks from the age of mammals. And those are rocks that were deposited as the current landscape was evolving and can teach us a lot about that. So, tried to stick with more familiar turf for tonight's program. The rocks from the Kaibab down to the Tapeats with the old acronym Know the Canyon's History, Study Rocks Made by Time. There are some other acronyms as well, Kissing Takes Concentration and that sort of thing, but I'm going to stick with Know the Canyon's History. And it covers a lot of the rocks that are in that one slot, that chapter 3, that Paleozoic era. But you can see that it doesn't cover all the rocks. So what's going on here? Well, the first geologist that we had working here in the Southwest was also the first one to try his hand at naming some rocks. He was a Frenchman, Jules Marcoux. He was a geologist on the Whipple expedition in 1853 and 1854. They were looking for railroad routes across the Southwest here. And when Marcoux came through, he was trying to correlate, match up the rock layers that he saw here in the Southwest to rock layers that he was familiar with in the eastern part of the United States and in Europe. And so he applied a couple of names in his explorations here in northern Arizona. The mountain limestone, which he identified in a few places here in northern Arizona and also on top of the Sandia Crest in New Mexico, east of Albuquerque, and the magnesian limestone, which he found between Winslow and Flagstaff. And today we can say that his magnesian limestone is part of the Kaibab. His mountain limestone, he applied to a lot of different rocks of different ages. Unfortunately, Marcoux never got to see the Grand Canyon. Then he would have been really confused. But it was a pretty ambitious project for 1855. He produced a geologic map of the entire United States. It's not the map that we draw today, but it was a place to start. The first geologist who actually saw the Grand Canyon, though, was John Strong Newberry, and he was the geologist on the Ives expedition. And unlike his boss, Lieutenant Ives, who thought that his was the first and would doubtless be the last party of whites, blah, 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 Newberry just loved this place. He loved the geology that he saw exposed here on the Colorado Plateau. Loved it so much that when he got back from the Ives expedition, he was on the Macomb expedition up into the Canyonlands country in southeastern Utah to try and find the junction of the Green and the Colorado rivers. When Newberry visited the Grand Canyon, he tried to apply Marcoux's identifications of rocks, but he didn't have much luck. He kept finding contradictions and stuff. He did make an identification of his own, though, again, extending an eastern name west. He named the Potsdam Sandstone, or identified the Potsdam Sandstone, down in near the bottom of the canyon. It's the layer we today know as the Tapete Sandstone. Um, there is a Potsdam sandstone. It's still used in the Lake Superior area, the upper Midwest. It's a sandstone and it's roughly the same age as the Tapetes. So Newberry wasn't too far off in guessing that the Potsdam and the Tapetes were the same thing. But it wasn't until 1871 that we finally got some names that we still use today here around the Grand Canyon. The Wheeler Survey was out here. It was one of the four great surveys of the American West, one of John Wesley Powell's competitors. And it had a couple of geologists, Grove Carl Gilbert and Archibald Marvine. They came out, they had the benefit of everybody else's maps, so they weren't as lost as the previous explorers were. And they started applying some names to the rock layers in the Grand Canyon. A little diagram there on the right, which I'm not sure if I can, it doesn't look like it. You can see that we have the Aubrey group, a name that we don't use too much anymore, but it's starting to come back. The Redwall group, Redwall is kind of a familiar name. And then down there at the bottom, the Tonto group. Now, it's easy to see where they got the name Redwall group. It's a good descriptive name of those red stained sandstones out there in the western part of the Grand Canyon. But why did they choose the name Tonto? This was well before the Lone Ranger was on TV. Well, I'm going to be talking a fair amount about the Tonto group. So just to make sure that everybody's familiar with it, the Tonto group is the group of rocks that form the Tonto platform. It's most prominent in the eastern part of the Grand Canyon. And the Tonto group is a group of three formations that were named by Levi Noble. They are the Muav, the Bright Angel, and the Tapetes. They are the made by time part of our mnemonic. The Tapetes forms the brown cliff at the brink of the Granite Gorge. The Bright Angel forms the broad bench of the Tonto Plateau. And then the Muav is the lowermost of those limestone ledges as you're moving up the canyon walls. Well, when they were naming the Tonto group, they did something geologists like to do. They did the same thing that Marcoux and Newberry were trying to do, extending names from elsewhere. And they were studying this Tonto group, and they've named it for the Tonto Basin in central Arizona. And you say, well, why would they do that? It's better developed, better exposed here in the Grand Canyon. Why did they import the name? Well, it was a case of mistaken identity. Gilbert and Marvine had followed the Tonto group east. They followed it down out of the Grand Canyon, down along the Aubrey Cliffs, along the Mogollon Rim. And by the time they got to the Tonto Basin, they found that their basal sandstone, what they called the Tonto sandstone, what we call the tapetes, they found huge, thick sandstone beds in the Tonto Basin in the Sierra Ancha. And so they decided, well, this is the place to name this group of rocks after. Well, later on, we found out that that massive sandstone in the Tonto Basin is not one layer of sandstone. It's actually at least a couple different layers of sandstone. And in today's terminology, what they call the Tonto sandstone is the Tapete sandstone, but under it is the much thicker and much older Troy quartzite, which is another sandstone. So they'd already named it and the name stuck, but the name was kind of like for the wrong reasons. So when we look at the Tonto group, the look at the Tonto group today, we find out that it's changed a little bit. On the left, you can see the traditional grouping where we have the Tonto group in green, the Tapetes, the Bright Angel, and the Muav. But recently, within about the last 5 years, the Tonto group has expanded. It's got 5 different formations in it now. The Tapetes is underlain by the 60-mile formation, and the Muav is topped by the Frenchman Mountain Dolostone. Part of the story here is that science is self-correcting. We've learned more things, and so we've put those other layers in there. But how did that come about? Well, we'll start off with the 60-mile formation. The 60-mile formation is what I call a lazy name. We have 25 units in the Grand Canyon that they're just named by how many river miles they are downstream from Lee's Ferry. Those were established by the Birdseye Expedition in 1923 when they were looking for dam sites in the Grand Canyon. And they were engineers. They weren't poets like some of the other name ascribing folks. But of those 25 units, only one is actually an official rock unit name per USGS, and that's the 60-mile formation. 60-mile formation is only found in the eastern Grand Canyon, and it was described in 1973 by the 2 guys at the bottom, Trevor Ford and Bill Breed. Ford came from England. He was an expert in old rocks, Precambrian rocks. Breed was from the Museum of Northern Arizona, and he knew his way around the Grand Canyon. And in 1970, in the early 70s, they had gone down to examine the Chuar group, the upper part of the Grand Canyon supergroup. And they were the first ones to divide that Chuar group up into individual formations. And at the very top, they found this red sandstone in a few places, and it was just nestled in there at the top of the Chuar group, and it had no fossils in it that they could find, and there was at the time no way of dating it, and so they assumed, okay, we only find it on top of the supergroup, so it must be part of the supergroup, and that's where they put the 60-mile formation. Well, in 2020, we developed a way of dating the 60-mile formation. And lo and behold, it was hundreds of millions of years younger than the supergroup. It was just right up there, almost at the bottom of the Tapete sandstone. We tucked it in the wrong group. It didn't belong in the supergroup. Instead, it was the initial deposits of the Tonto group as it was starting to form here in northern Arizona around 500 million years ago. So in 2020, the 60-mile formation was moved from the Grand Canyon supergroup up to the bottom of the Tonto group. Now, on top of the Tapete, or on top of the 60-mile, is the Tapete sandstone, and the Tapetes is one of our indigenous names. Tapetes Creek was named for Tapetes, who was a trusted guide on the second Powell expedition. Powell relied on these Paiute guides to get him around, to take him to the places that he wanted to study, and perhaps even more important, to get him to water so they didn't die out there. Interestingly enough, the map makers on Powell's second expedition honored Tapetes by naming Tapetes Creek, Tapetes Canyon after him. But if they'd asked Tapeats, he would have told them, no, this canyon already has a name, Savantkat. Um, but that didn't stick. Instead we call it Tapeats. And other Paiute guides found their names not only onto the landscape, thanks to the Powell expedition, but onto rock layers as well. The guide named Quagant, whose name wound up attached to a canyon and a formation, and Chuarumpec, whose name got abbreviated, but Chuar Valley and the Chuar group. So they did honor their Paiute guides with some names along the way. Now, on top of the Tapeat Sandstone, we have the Bright Angel Formation. It was named in 1914 by a fresh graduate of Yale named Levi Noble. He named it for Bright Angel Canyon, and I'm sure we all know the story of how Bright Angel Canyon got its name. When you read Powell's journal from his first expedition in 1869, they came on this clear, sparkling creek coming down from the North Rim, and in his journal, he named it Silver Creek. But sometime between the first and the second Powell expeditions, he decided that juxtaposing Bright Angel against Dirty Devil, the river that they'd named up in Utah, made a better story. And so in his published account of the trip, he talks about naming it Bright Angel. And Bright Angel Formation below it kind of blends into the Tapeats sandstone. The Tapeats gets less and less sandy and more muddy. And then as you go up through the Bright Angel and approach the Muav, the mudstones and stuff of the Bright Angel get less and less muddy and more limey. This blending of rock layers from the Tapeats to the Bright Angel to the Muav gives map makers fits. Oops, wrong button. There we go. On top of the Bright Angel, the Muav Formation, Powell in 1875 used what he called the Paiute name for pass or saddle to name the canyon that was draining the saddle between Powell Plateau and the North Rim. I'm a little skeptical of Powell's command of the Paiute language, but that's the way it's given. And then in 1914, Noble used the name of Muav Canyon to name his limestone. And then in 1945, Eddie McKee, a geologist who started out as a park naturalist here at the Grand Canyon, he extended Noble's Tonto names the entire length of the Grand Canyon. So he took the Tapeats, the Bright Angel, and the Muav, and extended those names the entire length of the Grand Canyon. And that's when the fun began, because you run into some problems as you move west in the Grand Canyon. So this diagram is the diagram that McKee drew. And the red line that I drew on it is where Noble was making his name designations. So you start from the bottom. At this time, the 60 Mile was not part of the Tonto group. So we start with the Tapeats. You go up through the sandstone of the Tapeats. Then you get into the mudstones of the Bright Angel. And then you get into the limestones of the Muav. And then some blue stuff up there on top that's very much like limestone that Noble just included in the Muav. That works just fine. But if you go further west, like out around where I have the numbers, and you come up through the Tapeats and the Bright Angel, and then you go into the Muav, but then, oops, we go back into the Bright Angel again. And then we come into the Muav, and then there's a whole bunch of that blue stuff up there on top. And so McKee's extension of those names had actually created two problems. And I've called them problem one and problem two. Problem one is those unmappable boundaries, the zigzags in the line and the way the members of the Tonto blend into each other. If formations are supposed to be mappable, how are you going to draw that on a geologic map? Sometimes there's a clear break that you can say, okay, this formation stops here and this formation starts there, but you can't split. And there are some clear breaks within the Tonto group as well, but there are no breaks in the Tonto group where you can split all the sandstone from all the shale and all the shale from all the limestone. So what subsequent scientists have been trying to do is use those definable breaks within the tonneau to define the breaks between the Tapeats, the Bright Angel, and the Muav. And in doing so, what happens is the rock types start getting mixed up. And so they go from being the Bright Angel Shale to the Bright Angel Formation because we start finding sandstones and limestones mixed in there. And that's actually happened, changing rock names to formation for a number of our rocks here in the Grand Canyon. The Kaibab limestone has a lot of sandstone in it, and so the name was changed in 1938. The Hermit Shale also has a lot of sandstone in it, and that name was changed to the Hermit Formation. The Temple Butte limestone in 1939 changed to the Temple Butte Formation. As far back as 1918, people wanted to change the Moab to the Moab Formation. And in 1989, the Bright Angel Shale to the Bright Angel Formation. But old habits die hard. And I've been, even though I know better, I've been known to sometimes use the old names for these formations. So finding the geologic gaps and then renaming the rock layer formation is kind of a solution to that first problem, the zigzaggy boundaries. The second, though, what do we do with all that blue stuff up on top? McKee published his work in 1945, and the stuff that was left over up on top, there were some things happening prior to 1945 when he was completing his research that kind of interfered with his ability to get out there in the field, like World War II. And so consequently, he was not able to date those rocks. And so he just referred to them as the unclassified dolomites. And for those of you who aren't familiar with dolomite is very much like limestone, but it has a little bit more magnesium and a little less calcium in it. Other geologists have studied them. They've said, well, maybe we should call it the Super Muav or the Grand Wash Dolomite. But as they traced this dolomite or this dolostone west, they started finding datable fossils in it. And there's an excellent outcrop of that rock layer near Las Vegas. It's called Frenchman Mountain, and it's on the east side of Vegas. It was named for a Belgian who apparently spoke French, I guess, named Paul Watley. And he was famous, got the mountain named after him because he salted a worthless mine with gold and sold it to somebody. So this was back in the 1800s, but Las Vegas has kind of kept up the tradition of luring people out of their money ever since. But because of those excellent exposures on Frenchman Mountain, the formation was named the Frenchman Mountain Dolostone, and that name became official just last year. So now the tonneau group has our familiar three formations that we all learned about, the Tapeats, the Bright Angel, and the Muav, but they're bracketed on the bottom by the 60 mile and on the top by the Frenchman Mountain Dolostone. And now we have this new and improved diagram. And this diagram is where we absolutely are falling into the trap of our little XKCD guys down there in the corner. So let's keep moving up the column. And the next layer up there is the Temple Butte Formation, originally called the Temple Butte Limestone, but we changed the name to Formation. The name was applied by Charles Walcott, and Charles Walcott was hired by the Powell Survey or the Geological Survey to come out and start working on the rocks in the Grand Canyon. He discovered the Temple Butte in Kanab Canyon when he was doing some work out in the central part of the Grand Canyon, and then named it in 1894. The big question is, who named Temple Butte? And research as I might, I could not find where the name came from. The first mention I find of it is Charles Walcott using the name or on a map that he drew in 1894. But he never mentions the name in the text of the paper, so no idea why. But I did learn one thing, and that was a Greek word, pleonasm, which means too much. Temple Butte, Mesa Butte, Table Mesa. Pleonasm means too much because you're saying the same word over again. So Temple Butte Formation, though, named for Temple Butte, just downstream from the mouth of the Little Colorado River, wherever that name came from. Now, earlier on, we were talking about the red wall, and the name was first applied by Gilbert and Marvin in 1875, but they may have been some of the early geologists, but they weren't dummies. They looked at all that limestone that they were naming the red wall, and they knew that there was more going on there than just a single formation. That's why they called it the red wall group. And sure enough, as time went on, we started finding different formations in it. The Temple Butte was part of that original red wall group. The Muav and the Frenchman Mountain Dolostone were also part of that original red wall group, as were some of the limestones that we find in the Supai group as well. So over the years, the red wall limestone or the red wall group gradually got pared down until today, the red wall limestone is a good formation. We've dropped the group name and used the limestone name instead. It's a very pure limestone. In fact, the cement for Glen Canyon Dam was made out of red wall limestone mined in the Verde Valley. And it's of a single age. It records a single advance of the Paleo-Pacific Ocean over Western North America. It came in two surges, but one big ocean out there. So the red wall is a good descriptive name, and even though the red is just a surface stain on the red wall, it still describes what the red wall usually looks like. And then we had a surprise. Long about 1964, people working in the canyon, especially some cavers, had noticed that there was this dark red stuff sitting on top of the red wall, but it didn't look like the supai that was up above the red wall. So George Billingsley, the guy on the left, on the bottom down there, started investigating this and found out that that dark red stuff that was sitting on top of the red wall, seen here at Fern Glen Canyon, in some places there were valleys carved as much as 400 feet deep into the red wall and then filled up with this formation. This was quite a surprise. Nobody had expected to find these deep erosional grooves carved into the red wall limestone. And fortunately, the formation is well exposed near Surprise Canyon. Um, Now, Surprise Canyon is one of those names that often gets confused because Grand Canyon has a Surprise Canyon and it has a Surprise Valley. Surprise Valley is just west of the Kaibab Plateau near Thunder River. Surprise Canyon is way out west, near the mouth of the Grand Canyon, kind of near the Skywalk, um, opposite the Skywalk, opposite the Wallapai Reservation. Well, George Billingsley and Stan Buse, who is a geology professor down at NAU, teamed up to describe this new rock layer that they found, and they wanted to name it the Surprise Formation because they were so surprised and because it was exposed near Surprise Canyon. But there was already a Surprise Formation in California. So that's why the Surprise Canyon has this two-part name, Surprise Canyon Formation, to differentiate it from the Surprise Formation out in California. Might also mention that the name Surprise Canyon was first applied apparently by Birdseye. He did have some inspiration there. Instead of just naming it a river mile, he, in his field notes, named it Bottleneck Canyon because of the narrow gorge that it entered the Granite Gorge, the Lower Granite Gorge in. But later on, apparently decided to name it Surprise Canyon instead of Bottleneck because that's how it appears on the final expedition maps. When we move up from the Surprise Canyon, we get into the Supai. And the Supai has always been a problem. It was kind of included in the Red Wall group and kind of included in the Aubrey group. And so finally in 1910, a geologist, Darton, came out here to try and just clean things up. And so he took the Supai, all those red stair-steppy layers in the canyon that look like each other, and he said, this is the Supai Formation. It lies between the Red Wall and the Coconino Sandstone. and that was his Supai formation. He named it for the Havasupai village of Supai because the formation is so well exposed there in Havasu Canyon. Interestingly enough, Supai is not really a Havasupai word. It's pieces of two Havasupai words garbled in English, uh, Havasu and Baj. Um, but people looked at the Supai and they said, I think there's more going on here than just what we see here. And so Eddie McKee studied the Supai for years, 40 years. He studied the Supai and he found that there were divisions within the Supai. And so he divided up the Supai, changing it from a formation into a group. The top formation in the Supai had already been called the Esplanade. The Esplanade sandstone. The Esplanade was a name applied by Clarence Dutton, who liked those highfalutin English or European sounding names. So the Esplanade already kind of had an unofficial name, but the lower three names, the Waskagami, the Manakacha, and the Watahamaji, uh, McKee named for Havasupai families in Supai. The scuttlebutt was that these particular names were chosen for families that had helped him out while he was doing his research out there. But remember, you can't name formations after a family. You have to name them after a geographic location. Well, fortunately, when the topographic map was being made of the Western Grand Canyon, Evans decided to name a bunch of the points around Havasu Canyon after Havasupai families. And so um, McKee was able to find geographic locations that carried the family names that he was looking for his formations in the Supai. McKee wasn't the first one to split up the Supai, though. There were the Noble found some rocks out in the Hermit Basin, and Hermit Basin, of course, we know is named for Louis Boucher, a prospector and tour guide who lived out there. Not sure that he was really a hermit. I mean, he had tourist camps and he guided people around in the canyon, but he didn't live in Grand Canyon Village. He eventually sold his trails to the Santa Fe Railroad, and they became the nucleus for the Hermit Trail out there. But apparent, don't know if it was because he didn't like the deal or what, but he left Grand Canyon shortly thereafter in 1909. Hermit Basin was named in 1906, though, um, and Noble named the rock layer that he found in the basin in 1922. He named it the Hermit Shale, but it has a lot of sandstone, so we renamed it. And the channels, the red dashed line outlines one of those stream channels carved into the top of the esplanade that clued Noble in to the fact that the Hermit was separate from the rest of the Supai group. Moving up the canyon walls, we get to uh, Darton again, the Coconino Sandstone. The Hopi people refer to the Havasupai as the people who live out to the west. And the Hopi word for that is often rendered in English as Kohonina. But fortunately, since Kohonina is a name that's used by archaeologists to describe an archaeological culture, Kohonina is also garbled in English into the word Coconino, which is the name of the plateau that forms the south rim. And that is what Darton named the Coconino Sandstone for, named it for the Coconino Plateau. So this is a garbled indigenous name that got applied to the Grand Canyon, even though the Hopi didn't call the Coconino Plateau or the Kohonina Plateau. Above the Coconino lies the Toroweep. McKee split the Toroweep off from the Kaibab limestone in 1938. He discovered that it represented an independent advance of the sea, separate from the Kaibab above it, and he named the lower formation the Toroweep. When Toroweep Valley, which McKee named the Toroweep Formation for, when Thompson, who was Powell's brother-in-law and in charge of the surveying of the second Powell expedition, when he named the Toroweep Valley, he thought it meant dry wash. But if we look in the modern Paiute lexicography or whatever, we find out that the Toroweep Valley actually has several different Paiute names, none of which is exactly Toroweep or exactly Tuweep for that matter. And probably represents the fact that the Paiute is a living language. It's a living people, and languages evolve with time. Finally, we get to the rim of the Grand Canyon, the mountain lying down. The Kaibab limestone is named for the Kaibab Plateau by, again, Darton. He came out here to clean things up. Interestingly enough, in the late 1800s, the early settlers, especially the Mormon folks over in Kanab, called the plateau Buckskin Mountain. But the Paiute name, this is a Paiute name that, although garbled, actually got applied to the thing that the Paiutes were naming, Pavavitsi, and the Powell expedition, the Powell mapping teams consistently referred to the plateau as the Kaibab Plateau, which makes me think that maybe they're the ones that popularized the name Kaibab over buckskin. So now we come to the end. And does this all matter? Of course, knowing where these names came from does add another dimension to the view that we get when we're standing up there on the rim. Differentiating all those rocks helps us to understand the geology of the canyon, what this 277-mile cross section of the Earth's crust is telling us, what happened over the 1.5 billion years of Earth's history that's intermittently represented by those different rock layers, how those ancient landscape processes worked, and how the modern landscapes evolved. But at the same time, it's not for everyone. And I'll admit, I gave a 2-hour geology lecture this morning where I didn't give them the name of a single rock layer. So it's not for everyone, but it does help us to link to this landscape and perhaps establish a different kind of connection to it, a more cultural connection than just the straight geology. And of course, this is just the beginning. This is just 16 of those different rock layers that I researched. So if we want to know the canyon's history, we need to really pay attention. We need to know the canyon's history even when mankind wasn't studying rocks that are famously made by time slowly. I don't know if that's going to catch on or not, but that covers the rock layers of that third group, the layered Paleozoic rocks of the Grand Canyon, and brings us to the end. So happy to answer any questions that anybody has, or if your brain is spinning, you might want to listen to other folks.
Well, thank you, Carl. I'm picking up from Wayne, who had to step away. I'm Tom Sulpizio, and I see one person has their hand up. Is that you, Slim? I don't know if that's a hand up or not. Yes, it is a hand up. Anyway, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat box. If you have a comment, you can put it in the chat box. If you would like to speak and ask Carl directly, there is you can just do that again in the chat box, or there's a raise hand icon somewhere on the bottom on Zoom. But
let's see.
I'm looking to see if there's anyone that would like to ask Carl. This was a master class in geographic history, and we're
a whirlwind tour.
we're very thrilled to have you give us such a lecture, Carl. So from Beth Cook to everyone, about from the river, the layers are obvious. What are the prominent layers in Marble Canyon?
Marble Canyon, you start with the Kaibab limestone there at Lee's Ferry, and then as you move downstream at the tail end of Marble Canyon, right there at the mouth of the Little Colorado, the Tapeats sandstone has poked up. So you move down through the whole sequence of rocks that I was talking about tonight. And then once you get below the mouth of the Little Colorado, below Marble Canyon, that's when you start picking up the supergroup and the Vishnu basement rocks.
Great. Werner Stanfill has a question for everyone, but I think this one could be directed to you, Carl. Very interesting. Is there a book about this? Carl,
If somebody will publish it. I have about 180-page manuscript that I've put together that covers all these things, but still in search of a publisher.
Cindy Stafford has Kern and Cindy. It shows Kern as the person signed in, but this is Cindy. When missionaries followed us walking home one evening, let me see here, and asked about if we were attending church, Kern responded, the church of great outdoors. One responded, but you believe in God, don't you? I said, I believe in rocks of the rock of ages. So it's a nice religious thought from Cindy and Kern this evening. Thank you both.
Mhm. Mhm.
And these, I mean, you have the foundation there. How many MY, how many, I guess you can even say BY, how many billion years does the base of your chart go back to?
The very oldest rock in the Grand Canyon is 1.84 billion years,
Okay.
and that would be the Elds Chasm gneiss,
Mm-hmm.
which is named for Elds Chasm.
So Kathy Mascaro responded, and when it's to everyone, it really is a question for you, Carl. I thought I was going to be a little bored by the topic, but you made it really interesting and understandable. Great talk.
Thank you.
Dennis, to the layman like me, how does the Temple Butte limestone differentiate from the red wall? Differentiate itself from the red wall.
There's actually a gap in time between them. So what happened was we had here at the Grand Canyon, in the eastern Grand Canyon, a very shallow sea, and the Temple Butte fills in tidal channels, and it's a thin sheet of limestone. Then that sea retreated back out again, and we had a period of erosion that planed off the upper part of the Temple Butte. We don't know how much of that there was of that upper part because it was removed, and then on top of that, then the red wall came in on top of it. And we can pick that out because there was time for the Temple Butte to change from just a limey ooze like you would find on the seafloor, turn into rock, erode, and then at the base of the red wall, we find little pebbles of limestone and stuff that the advancing red wall sea churned up from that eroded Temple Butte surface.
Thanks. Beth made a very, Beth has given you a compliment, fascinating presentation. Thank you. Kim Christensen, to everyone. This is kind of echoes what I was thinking when you were presenting. Boy, it sure shows how hard it is to describe the Grand Canyon in words. I loved your presentation. That's so true. It's the complexities of these rock layers and the formations. You really rendered that into something quite understandable. That's why you made the chart available to everyone to reference after the talk, because the way you covered the chart from the bottom up, it was really a brilliant explanation.
Yeah, that's how I tend to think of. Some people like to start at the present and work their way back.
Right.
I like to start at the beginning and lay the foundation and then build up from there. But whatever works.
And Jody Gephardt also gave a compliment. Excellent presentation. So we're coming to the top of the hour, everyone, and this is the time of the year when Arizona is Mountain Standard Time. California, where I am, is Pacific Standard Time. So it's 7 p.m. in Arizona, 6 p.m. here in California. And if there are no further questions, I'm going to stop the recording, and we will be ending the webinar this evening. So I'm going to stop the recording.